Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all out on a beautiful sunny day. It really should be an hour earlier, but we moved the clocks ahead an hour, so it stays light later. Seems earlier. So my name's Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies program here at Brown. I'm also a professor of religious studies and East Asian studies here at Brown. If you haven't heard about contemplative studies, we're a relatively new concentration here at Brown and program here at Brown. We study human contemplative experience across culture and across time from scientific, artistic, and humanistic perspectives. We also have developed methods in the classroom for teaching contemplative practices, but always within the context of the historical and cultural traditions from which they have been developed, in which they've been developed, and in terms of scientific research these days, from which they've been detextualized and recontextualized. So this is, I want to thank you on behalf not only of the Contemplative Studies program, but also of the Office of the Chaplains and Religious Life. We share this Mary Interlandi Memorial Lecture Series, and I want to just say a few words about Mary and her family. And of course, we're always in their debt. This is the beginning of the 15th annual Mary Interlandi Lecture Series. We're very, very fortunate this week not to have just one person invited as invited guests, but two people. And if you haven't yet seen the program, then we have not only tonight's lecture, but we also have a kind of combined text study and yoga practice event tomorrow evening that's in the Goldfarb Social Hall at Hillel from 6 o'clock. And then also on Thursday evening, we have a lecture by Professor Mark Singleton, the colleague of Professor James Mallinson. So this is a series that was started by Mary's family. Mary was a student here at Brown and would have graduated in the class of 2005. During the first year that we were getting together to start talking about developing contemplative studies at Brown, Mary was in one of our classes and got very excited about the idea, went home and talked to her parents about it, and then very tragically met an accidental death during winter break. Her parents, of course, very distraught, decided that they would like to do something to memorialize her, and ended up creating this lecture series, which has had some really interesting people from all different contemplative traditions over the previous 14 years in which we've held it. We're very grateful to Mary's family for establishing the lecture series. I also want to thank the committee that worked with me on this program, and I'd like to ask them to stand up for recognition, brief recognition. Professor David Bukta, Professor Srinivas Reddy, Professor Finn Garrity, and last but not least, although she may have left the building, I'm not sure, our program manager for contemplative studies, Ann Hireman-Hart, without whom none of any of these details would have been successfully worked out. So it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. James Mallinson. He's from the School of Oriental and African Studies of London University, where he's a senior lecturer in Sanskrit and Indian studies. He received a bachelor's degree in Sanskrit and Old Iranian at Oxford, a master's degree from SOAS in South Asian ethnography, his PhD from Oxford, working on an early Haṭhayoga text, translation and analysis. He is the author or translator of 8 books and numerous articles, and he has collaborated on a wonderful text that some of you are reading in the classes that we're teaching right now, The Roots of Yoga. They have Dr. Mallinson and his colleague Mark Singleton have compiled these texts from translations of material related to Hatha Yoga. Many of these texts have never been published before. It's a wonderful penguin paperback. I see some of you have it in the audience and are using it in class. I highly recommend it if you don't have it. They're part of, actually they founded and have developed this 5-year research project for translating the major, either retranslating or translating for the first time the major texts of the Hatha Yoga tradition. Dr. Mallinson is also the chair of a brand new Center for Yoga Studies that was just established at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Please join me in giving a warm, brown welcome to Dr. James Mallinson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hal. Can you hear me okay? Is it coming out the speaker? Excellent. I've got the joy of a radio mic. Yeah, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real honor to be at Brown in this beautiful campus, and also we've been put up in the most amazing house. Yeah, thanks for everything. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you tonight. Excuse me if I'm a little bit bleary. Just flew in last night from the crazy Brexit land, so I haven't had a lot of sleep, and not too worried about things over there, but it is pretty crazy. I'm going to talk to you, as you can see, about Tantric traditions and Hatha Yoga. Now, these are two big things, okay? So they both need some explanation, although I'm going to slightly cop out with Tantric traditions. I know that many of you know quite a lot about it. The students have been studying it in class and so forth. So all I'm really going to say about Tantric traditions is that, contra to what people who don't know much about them might think, Tantra was not some kind of esoteric specialist thing that was going on, amongst weird sects in India over the years. But from about 500 to about 1300, Tantra in its Shaiva manifestation, so Tantric religions in which Shiva was the main god, was the dominant religious tradition of India. And that's been set out very, very well at great length by my old PhD supervisor from Oxford, Alexis Sanderson. And not only the Shaiva traditions, so not only the Tantric traditions in which Shiva is the main deity, but then there are other Tantric traditions with Vishnu, and also Buddhist Tantric traditions in which various esoteric forms of Buddhism are practiced as well. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because, well, I'll say a little bit more, but Tantra really infused Indian religion completely during that period, and to this day now, it's pretty hard to disambiguate, to find any aspect of Indian religious practice on which Tantra has had no effect, in particular the yogic traditions. So, prior to the advent of Tantra in about the 5th, 6th century, we obviously have lots of evidence for yogic traditions in the form of the Patanjala traditions from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and we go back to, there's plenty on yogic practice in the Mahabharata and so forth. But from the time of Tantra, from the 5th and 6th century onwards, Tantra gets yoga gets completely infused with Tantric teachings and practices. Now, Hatha Yoga, as a kind of distinct phenomenon by that name, doesn't appear in the Indian tradition until about the 11th or 12th century. Hatha Yoga is the focus of the research project that Mark and I are working on. So it's something that is occupying me very closely for the last few years. But I have a sort of working definition of it for when I'm talking about it, and I think that's my first slide, I believe. So it's a method of yoga in which physical techniques predominate, okay? And that in itself is somewhat ambiguous, because yoga can mean both practice and goal, but I suppose that sort of works there as well. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about how I've come to that definition and how the name Hatha Yoga first appeared, and then how it evolved and how it came to encompass physical yoga practice. In terms of the relationship between Hatha Yoga and Tantra, what I think we can say is that the Hatha Yogic traditions I mean, yeah, because if we're trying to talk about the relationship between Tantra and Hatha Yoga, and as I said, Tantra is basically Indian religion during this period, the period when Hatha Yoga appeared in the 11th or 12th century. The relationship, the specific connection with Hatha Yoga is that the Hatha Yoga practices were the practices of the celibate ascetic traditions within all these distinct tantric traditions. Okay, so each lineage, whether it's the Vajrayana tantric Buddhist lineages or the Shaiva traditions and so forth, within those traditions you will find these adepts, these full-time sort of professional practitioners of ascetic techniques, and it's from those traditions which Hatha Yoga developed. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to look at how Hatha Yoga developed, how these physical techniques developed, and then analyze in particular, specifically, the different tantric traditions that were responsible for them, and how their methods manifested within Hatha Yoga as taught in text. Primarily, I'm going to be looking at text, but I've also got quite a lot of pictures as well to help illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, Hatha Yoga as a category within text, as I said, doesn't appear until about the 11th or 12th century. Prior to that, we do know that ascetics were doing physical practices. But what we don't have are texts specifically teaching those practices. Now, this is, I think, again, one of these things of having worked on this subject for a long time, it's sort of slowly been dawning on me the importance of this, is that within the ascetic traditions of India, everything gets passed down orally, and almost nothing is written down apart from these Hatha Yogic practices, which I'm going to talk about later on. We know that Indian ascetics were practicing physical techniques from, so as I said, they don't have their own text, but from travelers. So Alexander the Great, for example, he arrived in India in the beginning of around 300 BC, and he met various ascetics who were holding strange, difficult postures all day long. We know from early Buddhist traditions, the Buddha is said to have tried various physical techniques, which in some sort of streams, textual transmissions, he rejects them, and actually in other ones, interestingly, he doesn't reject them, and they're seen as a stage on the path towards enlightenment. And then also another source we have for these physical techniques of ascetics in the early period is in statuary, in artistic productions, material production. I think so what I'm going to look at first of all is some of the practices that these ascetics did prior to the production of the Hatha Yoga corpus. So we have, here's the first images from the stupa at Sanchi, probably 1st century BC. And if you see in the bottom left, you see these two ascetics with their arms in the air. Now this is a recurrent theme in the descriptions, and the kind of, I don't know if we can use this category really, but the sort of etic descriptions from other traditions. They talk about what these more extreme ascetics were doing with their bodies, and one of the things is they hold their arms up in the air for years on end. And another thing I'd like to emphasize is how these things, a lot of these practices, in fact almost all of them, still go on to this day. So this is an ascetic who I've seen at various Kumbh Melas over the years. He's called Amar Bharati, and he's been holding his one arm up in the air for 40 years. And he, interesting enough, describes his practice in Hindi as Prachin Yoga, so the ancient yoga, the original ancient yoga. And this is a theme within early treatments, like so the Mahabharata, for example, often talks of ascetics doing these extreme practices and uses the word tapas, which means asceticism, but also yoga, and it's almost impossible to disambiguate the two. So these things that are clearly not, very far removed from how we understand yoga today, and something that will cultivate the body. They are understood to be yoga to this day by these ascetic traditions. This is another practice mentioned by the Buddha in the Pali Canon, in which it's referred to as the Vaguli Vata, which means the bat penance hanging upside down. You may recognize it from the cover of Roots of Yoga. This one doesn't, it's not heard, and I've never come across anyone practicing it today, although we know actually only 100 years ago it was still pretty current. We have some travelers' reports, but it seems to have died out now. And this is an image from an illustrated manuscript of the Ramayana in the British Library, which kind of shows the whole complex of practices associated with these ascetic traditions from more than 2,000 years ago up to the present day. And as I say, apart from this hanging upside down from trees, you can see pretty much all of these different practices being done. In fact, for the very first time, I've heard about this one where in winter an ascetic will sit submerged in freezing cold water in the middle of the night. And I'd never seen it before, and I just saw it a month ago now at the Kumbh Mela for the first time. And this guy was getting up at 4 o'clock every morning and having 108 pots of freezing cold water poured over his head. So it does. I wasn't sure if it still went on, but now I can confirm that it does. And this is also from about a month ago at the Kumbh Mela festival that I was at. This is part of this same sort of complex of practices. This is in Hindi called dhuni tap. Now dhuni is the smoking fire, and tap is the Hindi form of tapas. So the idea is that they're doing these practices to generate tapas, which means heat as well as austerity. They're generating this kind of spiritual power within their bodies. And often this is associated with yoga, and some of these ascetics would do yoga postures as we would recognize at the end of their practice. So that's a sort of summary of this kind of, a quick overview of this ancient tradition of physical ascetic practice. Now, so around the 11th century, we see this new codification of physical practice in Sanskrit texts. And they don't, some of the things that are done by these more extreme ascetics are codified, not all of them. So we don't, there's no text telling you how to hold your arm up in the air for 12 years or anything like that. But we do also, there does seem to be a shift. There does seem to be something new coming in about 1,000 years ago. So we see the introduction of these complex sort of balancing postures. So prior to that, we hear about ascetics standing up for years on end or holding their arms up in the air for years on end. Then these postures come in that you couldn't do indefinitely. And I'll show a few pictures of those in a minute, but sort of balancing postures that can only be held for a few minutes or an hour maximum. We get the introduction in the Hatha texts of complex methods of breathing. Prior to that, pranayama is very important in treatments of yoga, but it's just generally a simple alternate nostril breathing. Okay, and it's associated with tapas as well. But then we get these new kind of bastrika, where you're pumping the breath in and out, special methods of breathing where you're able to float on water, breathing through the curved tongue and so forth. So there's a new development there. We also have, the third thing I've got here, these dynamic methods of manipulating the vital energies, which in Haṭhayoga texts are collectively called mudras. So, and I'll talk a fair bit more about them as well. And then finally, cleansing techniques. These are also introduced in the Hatha text. And I think I've got some images of these now. So, yeah, the very first complex posture that we find in any Sanskrit text is this, the Mayurasana. I haven't seen any very old depictions. The first text that teaches it is probably from the 10th century. It's called the Vimanarchana Kalpa. I'll talk a bit more about that later and about the Tantric tradition it comes from. But we don't get any images until relatively late. And of course, this is still practiced today. It's quite commonly used among ascetics today. And this ascetic is actually from the same lineage as the first text which teaches it. Also, one of the second sort of balancing posture that we find in text is this Kukkutasana in a text from about the 11th or 12th century. And then, again, it's still practiced to this day. And then so this is one of the most exciting discoveries, actually, of the research project I've got going on with Mark. And Mark and I visited there. I'd been there a year before with another colleague. I went there in 2016 for the first time, quite by chance. This was en route somewhere, and I'd seen an obscure reference in a paper about it, because at the bottom here, now is this going to work? Around about here, on both sides of this gate, there are these sculptures of these Nath Siddhas, so these famous yogis from these Tantric lineages. And they're very early. They're much the earliest known depictions of these Siddhas that are around. So I wanted to go and see them. And then, just by chance, a very fortunate discovery, up here in the sort of these brackets up here are 84 yogis, of whom about 15 or so, or a dozen, are in these complex balancing postures. And I think I've got a few here. You can appreciate it's very difficult to get photographs of it, and that would be a long story in itself. Mark and I spent a few days, and in the end we got pretty good ones, but I think it deserves more study, this gate. But So these images they were carved in about 1230, and the next earliest depictions of complex yoga postures are from the early 16th century. So this was, push the date back about 300 years. So we've got these sort of headstand images. I could show you a lot, but I think I've only got 3 or 4. This looks like an inverted lotus posture. And of course, this gait is associated with the Nath tradition of Tantric yogis, who I'll say a bit more about later on. And a straight up headstand there. Now, this, as I mentioned earlier, so sometimes the ascetics who do the fire penance, at the end of it, they'll do some postures. And here we see a headstand. The headstand's an interesting one because it's associated actually in some ways with ascetic practice, with tapas, but it's also within the Haṭhayoga text, inverting the body is used to control the vital energy. So there's a general understanding, and I'll probably talk a bit more about this in my presentation tomorrow, but there's this understanding that the vital energies of the body are constantly flowing out, and so by controlling the breath, there are various methods of stopping that, but the most basic, simple one is just to use gravity and turn your body upside down. So it can be understood in both ways, and it's also commonly, it is associated with tapas and extreme ascetic practice. And this is another place that Mark and I visited. When did we go there first? Was it 2017? Yeah, a couple of years ago. And the temple on the top of this mountain here is a famous site associated with the legend of a yogi called Dharamnath, who it's the kind of creation myth of the area, because at the other side of the mountain is this place. This is in Kutch in Gujarat, so far western Gujarat on the border with India. And there's this area called the Run of Kutch, which is this huge dried salt flat. And the legend has it, and this is a kind of a recent painting on cloth that I saw at an exhibition in Delhi. And the Dharamnath is said, you can see here, he's meant to have stood on his head for 12 years. And then as a result of that, acquired so much of this ascetic power, this tapas, that the gods become scared. And this is a recurrent theme in Indian mythology of ascetics performing these penances and acquiring all this power. The gods become scared about what he's going to do with it, because they say when he opens his eyes, this blast is going to come out. And they get him to swivel away from civilization. He's actually, for some strange reason I haven't quite got to the bottom of, he's meant to be standing his head's on a betel nut. And he swivels 180 degrees, then opens his eyes and blasts away the sea. The sea was there before, so he dries up the sea. So we have these, sometimes these notions of tapas and also manipulation of the vital energies within the body are conflated, and you can never quite be sure why someone is doing it. This is another, and I mentioned the innovations of the Hatha tradition. So, about 1,000 years ago, for the first time, we get dynamic practices within text, dynamic techniques associated with yoga. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this tomorrow, and I'm going to show this tomorrow, but this is about the only, I was trying to think of a good, one of the practices involves yanking on your tongue in order to stimulate kundalini. I suppose I could have tried to demonstrate that. But this is the sort of closest to a bit of film of something that's similar to one of these practices, whereby this is Krishnamacharya, the famous yogi, sort of founder of various important lineages, and he drops himself onto his... so the idea is, it's not clear whether this is why he's doing this, but the idea is that he's held his breath, and it will, in the text that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, you hold your breath, you lift yourself up, you drop yourself down, and then the vital energies are meant to shoot up the central channel as a result. Was prior to that, all the physical methods used by these ascetics were static. And then finally, yes, cleansing techniques. So the Hatha Pradipika, which is probably a text from about 1400, that's the first text to introduce these methods of cleaning the insides, the inside of the body, which become very sort of closely characterized. Hatha yoga becomes very much characterized by them. So this is one called Nauli, the churning of the intestines. So we have no reference to any of these practices prior to the introduction of the Hatha corpus. Okay, so that's so I've talked about how the ascetic techniques of kind of bodily mortification, and then this turn, the kind of Haṭhayoga turn, in which we get a different mode of practice. We get these dynamic movements, we get these complex postures, and yoga starts to shift from something being associated with asceticism and mortifying the body towards cultivating the body, being something that's good for the body rather than trying to wither your arm or something in order to gain power. What I'm going to talk about now is how Hatha Yoga is first, how we first find it in textual traditions, and how it develops and how it comes, because it has these very specialized meanings at first, and then by this text that I just mentioned, the Hatha Pradipika, it comes to encompass physical practice as a whole. And the reason I want to do that is because through doing that, we can see the different traditions. We can see what tantric lineages lead into Hatha Yoga, and then I'll talk a bit more about the individual traditions that are part of it. So the very first, sorry, this is rather a lot of text. In fact, you probably don't need to read all of that, but the very first references to Hatha Yoga are in Tantric Buddhist texts prior to the Hatha corpus. And it has this very specific technical meaning of stopping ejaculation during Tantric Buddhist sexual ritual. Okay, and you can see at the end, what is it? Well, the bold. This is a definition from a commentary on the Kala Chakra Tantra, written in the 11th century, about the same time as the Kala Chakra Tantra. And by having forcefully made the breath flow in the central channel through the practice of nada. Now, that's not specified in these texts, but there are other references, and it's still not clear to me exactly what's meant by nada in these Tantric Buddhist texts. It then becomes a significant part of Hatha Yogic techniques, and it involves listening to the inner sounds that arise during yogic practice. But then it says which is about to be explained, but then it never actually gets explained in the text. And so by doing that, the yogin should attain the undying moment, which is what the goal of the practice that's being taught here. It's saying that if he can't manage it through the normal techniques, he has to employ Hatha Yoga, which is this sort of forceful and almost by implication dangerous method of restraining the drops of bodhicitta, i.e. semen, in the penis during the sexual ritual. That is Hatha Yoga. So it's quite a long way far removed from how we might understand Hatha Yoga now. But what we see next, the next usage of Hatha Yoga, is in a non-Buddhist text. So this is a Shaiva text. That's a Shaiva tantric work, which is the first text really to kind of talk about Hatha Yoga as we might understand it. I date it probably to the 12th century, can't really be sure. It's definitely later than the 11th century, and it's definitely earlier than the 14th century. I suspect it's relatively early 12th century. And here we get a couple of definitions, but slightly obscure definitions of Hatha. It gives these 4 different types of yoga practice: Laya, Hatha, Mantra, and Raja. And it defines Hatha as, Prabhanjana Ninada Kritaha. So it's performed by means of the breath, Prabhanjana, and Ninada, which is sound or resonance. So like nada, so it's very similar to what we had in that previous Tantric Buddhist definition. And I'm certain, for various reasons, if I'm giving a paper on this at the weekend, that the author knew these Tantric Buddhist definitions. He's taken this idea of Hatha Yoga, but he's applying it to something slightly different. The other definition is that it uses either nada or bindu. Now, bindu is the term for semen in these Hatha Yoga texts. So again, it harks back to that definition in the Kala Chakra Tantra's commentary, the Vimala Prabha. But he then identifies Hatha with 3 practices, okay? The Mahamudra, the Mahabandha, and the Mahaveda. Now, these are 3 methods of manipulating the breath within the body, and I'm going to talk about these at length tomorrow, okay? So I'm not going to say a great deal now. Mahamudra, you hold the breath, you stick out one leg, and you put your chin on your chest. Mahabandha, then you apply some locks within the body, and then Mahaveda. So Mahaveda is in some ways similar to that film I showed of Krishnamacharya. So you lift yourself up and drop yourself down. As I've moved on. And that's meant to send the breath up the central channel. Now, the next text to talk about Hatha Yoga is from an altogether different tradition. It's called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, and it's from a Vaishnava Tantric tradition, so a Tantric tradition in which Vishnu is the primary deity. And it's a kind of compilation. But it's sort of unique because it's a rather unique text, a rather wonderful text in that, unlike a lot of these works, it doesn't just borrow verses and chuck them all together haphazardly, but it rewrites everything. So even though we can be pretty confident that it's drawing on this Amaraga Prabodha, it reworks everything and writes it out in a new form. But in its definition of Hatha Yoga in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, we get these 3 techniques from the Amaraga Prabodha, then we get 6 more. Now these 4, 5, and 6, Mula Bandha, Jalandhara Bandha, and Uddiyana Bandha, are actually, in fact, they're in the Mahabandha of the Amaraga Prabodha, they're used. So this is kind of indicative of the nature of this text being a compilation, of trying to draw in from different traditions. And they are just different locks to be applied when holding the breath. I'll say a bit more about them later. Number 7, Viparita Karani, that I mentioned earlier again, that's the inversion. Okay? So this text is one of the main aims of its yoga is control of bindu, semen, as I mentioned earlier. So again, so Viparita Karani is meant to be very useful in that. If you do a headstand, that stops the downward flow, and the idea is that you need to keep the store of bindu or semen in the head. Khecarī Mudra, which Hal mentioned my PhD, that was a text called an edition of a text called the Khecarīvidyā, and the central practice of that is Khecarī Mudra. And in that practice, the tongue is turned back above the soft palate. There are various reasons for doing that. In this text, it's in order again to seal in the sort of nectar of immortality, or the bindu that's in the head and is constantly dripping down normally, but by sticking the tongue up there, you seal it in and you keep it in the head, so you stop the body from aging. And then number 9, Vajroli Mudra, that is a method of urethral suction, which again is closely associated with control of semen, or bindu as it's called in this text. And in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, that's what Hatha Yoga is. Those are the practices of Hatha Yoga. And then, finally, of these texts that classify Hatha Yoga, we've got the Hatha Pradipika, which I mentioned earlier. It's often, you'll find in secondary literature, it's normally referred to as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but within the text and manuscript edition, we never find that. So that's why I always use Hatha Pradipika. And that, again, is a compilation drawing from lots of different texts and borrowing, just chucking the verses in without altering them in any way, unlike the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. It borrows directly from both these texts, and it adds one more mudra, the Shakti Chalani Mudra, which literally means the stimulating the goddess practice, and that's the one I mentioned briefly earlier about when you yank on your tongue in order to lift up the bottom of the central channel, which thereby enables Kundalini to rise up it. But the Hatha Pradipika doesn't stop there. It doesn't just, Hatha is not all that. It's also, so there's a verse being very specific, 156, which says what the sequence of practices is in Hatha. You've got posture, asanam, kumbhakam, chitram, various methods of breath control, that's what I was talking about earlier. So the text teaches these complex methods of breathing, and the mudrakyam karanam tata, and techniques called mudras. So those were the 10 in this text, the 10 different techniques for manipulating the vital energies. And then finally, Nādanusandhana, which I mentioned again earlier, is concentration on the inner sounds that arise in the course of yoga practice. They're very important in pretty much all yoga texts. There are exceptions, but they're a kind of signpost along the way that you're progressing through the various stages of yoga, depending on which sounds you hear internally during your meditative practice. Okay, so that's from then on, from after the Hatha Pradipika, that's basically the definition of Hatha Yoga. And I should say that it's always embedded within meditative practice as well. There are these techniques of dharana, dhyana, samadhi, and so forth. Sometimes they are completely sort of made physical. You know, certain texts say that by just extending the length of your pranayama, which you become a master of through doing these physical practices, it's purely through the duration of breath retention and so forth that you enter these higher states. But that's not always the case. And so generally these practices are preliminary, or they're used to lead to a meditative state. They're with one or two exceptions, never an end in themselves. Okay, so with that definition, you often hear about Hatha Yoga that it was developed by the Nath tradition, and you get a couple of texts mentioned, one or two texts perhaps. But actually, once we've got the Hatha Pradipika's definition, we can then identify, I think I've got 20 texts that predate it, which teach these physical practices. So I've divided them up. First of all, these are all texts that we've identified that the Hatha Pradipika itself borrows from. So it actually incorporates verses from those texts. A lot of these texts we're editing as part of the research project at the moment. Quite a few have not been published. Then there are related texts which teach things that are found in the Hatha Pradipika but predate it. Some of them are not in Sanskrit. You see we've got the Tirumantaram, the Gyaneshwari, and then a couple more which are completely distinct. Number 19 is interesting. It's by a Jain author called Hemachandra, who's an amazing sort of polymath, wrote a huge range of different texts, and he's got this very extensive yoga shastra that he wrote in the 12th century, and then he wrote an auto-commentary on it, it's called the Svabhagya Vritti, and that is a very extensive, voluminous commentary on the basic yoga shastra that he's taught. So a bit like the general consensus now with Patanjali's Yoga Shastra or Yoga Sutra is that the commentary on it was composed by Patanjali at the same time. So there's this idea of scholars writing these short texts and then expanding upon them. Now in the expanded commentary, he teaches various postures that we don't find elsewhere, including complex variations on headstands and so forth. But the text is absolutely infused with tantric techniques as well, visualizations, mantras and so forth. I won't say anything more about that, but it's just to illustrate the point that I made earlier that Tantra had just, was everywhere by this point. So we generally don't think of Jainism as a tantric tradition, but Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra is tantric from beginning to end and full of mantras, visualizations, and so forth. Okay. Now, sorry about this big body of text, and don't worry, there's lots of sort of things that won't mean much to many people, but the point I'm trying to make here as well with this slide is how, again, Hatha Yoga is normally said to be associated with the Nath Sampradaya, which is a kind of a lineage of Tantric yogis, okay? But actually, it's much more complicated than that. And the way I understand it, what was going on was that physical yoga practice was prevalent among all these different traditions, and then over the course of the sort of 11th to 14th centuries, they all wrote their own texts on how it should be done, okay? And so we see here, I'll just try and summarize. Number one, they're all the different lineages that then go in to make the Nath Sampradaya. So the Naths is in itself extremely complex, heterogeneous group of different traditions, ranging from cremation ground dwelling tantrics to snake charmers, anything basically that could be derived from these Shaiva tantric texts. But the ones who practiced Hatha Yoga were these tantric Buddhists. I mentioned, I haven't actually, I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but the Amarāga Prabodha, so that first text which talks about Hatha Yoga and names those three practices, that actually takes those teachings from a Buddhist text called the Amrita Siddhi, which I'm also editing as part of our project at the moment. Then we get these different tantric lineages that came to be part of the Nath tradition. I won't go into the details about that. I'm going to talk a bit more about them. And then we have Vedantic traditions that are fully infused with the Khecarīvidyā school of Tantra, which developed in the south of India and is now, today is probably the best known form of Tantra. We have these, associated with Shankara himself. So Shankara was a is now closely associated with these Khecarīvidyā forms of Tantra. More orthodox kind of Brahmanical Vaishnava Tantric traditions. Again, I'm going to look a bit more closely to them in a minute, but these Vaikhanasa and Pancharatrika traditions. The Dattatreya Yoga Shastra that I mentioned, that comes from an altogether different Vaishnava Tantric tradition. And then these Advaita Vedantins, these ones actually, the Aparokshanubhuti and Yoga Taravali, they're probably the least tantric of all the different ones, and if you told them they were tantric, they probably wouldn't like it. But everyone else would be quite happy to be recognized as a tantric tradition. These Kalamukas, yeah. The whole point of this is just to show the many different tantric derived traditions that produced Hatha Yoga texts in the early period. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 3 of them now, because they contributed some of the core practices that we understand to be central to Hatha Yoga. So the first one, I've got Tantric Buddhism, Nath Shaivism. So if we go back to this one, it's the text associated with that, the Amrita Siddhi and the Amaraga Prabodha, and then a different form of the Nath Shaivas, and then thirdly, some Tantric Vaishnava traditions. So firstly, I'm going to look at the Hatha tradition in these 2 texts. Now, the Amrita Siddhi is a particularly fascinating text, which I'm going to talk about at length tomorrow. And so it's the first text to teach Hatha practices, but confusingly, it doesn't actually call them Hatha. And it's not until the Amaraga Prabodha, which I mentioned earlier, takes those practices, teaches them, but in a much shorter form, and says that these are Hatha Yoga, that we find practices called Hatha Yoga. Now, the Amrita Siddhi presents this very detailed, coherent yoga method, which is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow in detail. So I won't go too closely into it, but it involves these 3 mudras that I mentioned. The Maha Mudra. Oh, yes, sorry, I forgot I was going to show these pictures, so I didn't need to try to say what the practices were. We've got the Maha Mudra, the Maha Bandha, which is where you apply a lock here and a lock at the bottom of the central channel, and then the Maha Veda. Now, this is the dynamic movement, which isn't shown properly. Obviously, you can't really show it in a miniature, but this is the one where you lift up and drop yourself down. Now, in this tradition, there's no kundalini, there's no chakras. It's all about manipulating the breath and manipulating the vital energies, the bindu. And also, what we find, and this is a recurrent theme in the Hatha Yoga texts, we find that within the body of the male yogin, because these texts are always written by men, for men, they're the products of male celibate monastic traditions. We know that there were women practicing yoga at this time, but we don't have any texts. We have no real details. We have no details on what they were actually doing. But key to the focus of their practices is the control of bindu or semen within the body. So I've given you the yoga of the Amrita Siddhi and the Amaraga Prabodha. The point of it is to make the breath enter, rise up the central channel, pierce 3 knots, and thereby raise the sun. There's the idea that you've got the sun at the bottom of the central channel. I'm going to go into much more detail about this tomorrow. Join it with the moon in the head. And as a result of that, you gain control over bindu, or semen, stays in the head, and you attain samadhi and, crucially, liberation while living, jivan mukti. So the idea is that you become liberated, but you don't, you can then exist as a person in the world. You can live a relatively normal life, but you're enlightened at the same time. Now, this is a folio of a manuscript of the Amrita Siddhi. This is just sort of, and I've just actually today, an article of mine's gone into a journal called Religions, pointing out, showing how this, the Tantric Buddhist tradition kind of became part of this Tantric Shaiva Hatha Yoga tradition. And there are various reasons, and we can see that, first of all, that the Amaraga Prabodha borrows verses directly from, this is a manuscript of the Amrita Siddhi, so it borrows verses directly from that text. And through various sources, able to identify this region, this place, Kadri, in a place called Mangalore in South India, as the area where this is likely to have happened. And I just by way of, because it's a pet obsession of mine at the moment, I just want to show you the kind of iconographical way we can see that the Tantric Buddhist tradition became the Tantric Shaiva tradition. And what we see here, so this is the temple that's at this place, Kadri, today. And you see you've got the central shrine there. And in the central shrine there is actually just a small kind of aniconic rock, which is said to be a form of the god Shiva. But then to the side of it, we have these wonderful 11th century bronze images of Tantric Buddhist deities. And they've been kind of shoved to the side now. I think it's pretty clear that this one was originally in the main, you know, the place of honor. But now it's at the side and worshipped as Brahma now, okay, as the Hindu god Brahma. But it's clearly the Tantric Buddhist god, or Bodhisattva Manjushri, or actually Manju Vajra probably. And then on the other side, we have this form of the Tantric Buddhist Bodhisattva Lokeshwara, okay? And then we have Buddha here as well. And Lokeshwara is worshipped as Vishnu and Buddha as Vyasa. Now the point I want to make here is we can see actually the iconography next to the temple, or up the hill from the temple, is a monastery of the Haṭhayoga tradition, okay? And the first human guru of that tradition it was called Matsyendra. And so this statue of him is in the Mangalore Museum, because at some point it got broken, it would have got moved out of the temple. But we still have, well, yes, you can't really see much here at all. My photograph is not very good. They don't actually let you take photos in the museum, so I had to sneak this one from outside the window. But you can see up here, there's one of these cosmic Buddhas, okay? So the Bodhisattvas of Tantric Buddhism, they will each have, in the iconography and on their heads, they have one of these cosmic Buddhas, which shows what lineage they're part of, okay? And this is Amitabha in this case. And you can't really see much in this image. Sorry, I said that the wrong way around. I think it's about 1 in the morning for me. I'm getting a bit dozy. I apologize. But this is Lokeshwara. He's got the cosmic Buddha of Amitabha. But then what we find in the, so that's the old Matsyendra, and this is the new Matsyendra. So he's been replaced in the monastery, okay? And we get a better view here, and we can see that there's some kind of form of, looks like the god Shiva, or maybe even another yogi. But this is totally unique within the non-Buddhist tradition in India, okay? We never see this on a Hindu statue. So it's very clear, and also the rest of the iconography of Matsyendra here is closely modeled on Lokeshwara, as you can see. Okay, so this is just one aspect of a broader way we can see through texts and through local legends and through the iconography here, how the Tantric Buddhist tradition has developed, has changed into the Nath Shaiva tradition, which then in which this one stream of Haṭhayoga developed. And this is now I'm going to talk about another stream of this Haṭhayoga tantric practice, another stream of the Nath Shaivas in particular, which is represented in these 3 texts, Vivekamartanda, Goraksha Shataka, and the Khecarīvidyā, which I talked about earlier, the one about Khecarīmudra that I edited for my PhD. Now, they use similar techniques. I mentioned earlier, there's Mula Bandha, Jalandhara Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha. Now, they're locks for holding the breath in certain positions in the body during breath control. So this is the Mula Bandha. There's Uddiyana Bandha. Uddiyana Bandha is done by pulling up the abdomen. And then Jalandhara Bandha is done by locking the chin onto the chest. Sorry, that's my mic, wasn't it? Avoid that. And another associated practice, Khecarīmudra, the one I mentioned earlier about turning the tongue back. Now that not only, so in some traditions, that is associated with raising Kundalini. I mentioned earlier the Shakti Chalani, where if you pull the tongue, it's meant to stimulate Kundalini, the coiled goddess who's at the bottom of the central channel. And Khecarīmudra is also said to do that. And I don't know if you can see here, but this rather nice miniature, you can sort of see that this is the snake Kundalini who has been straightened up and gone up the central channel as a result of Khecarīmudra practice. So it seems to me that these practices are actually sort of predicated on the methods taught in the previous lineage of Nath yogis I was talking about, the Amaraga Prabodha and Amrita Siddhi. So the first bit, make the breath enter and rise up the central channel, piercing the 3 knots along the way. That's the same. But then what happens here is rather than the sun and Bindu rising up the central channel, Kundalini goes up the central channel through the 6 chakras up to Shiva in the head. And then Kundalini, who is the coiled form of the goddess within the body, when she joins with Shiva, then the two dissolve into one another. In one of these texts, the Gorakshashataka, the two dissolve away and final liberation is attained. And effectively, that's it for the yogi. He just kind of enters this eternal samadhi. Or in the Khecarīvidyā, another text, what happens is Kundalini gets to the head and there's this store of amrita, the nectar of immortality, in the head, which she then kind of takes with her as she goes back down the central channel, flooding the body, making it immortal, rejuvenating it, and bringing about this jivan mukti, liberation while living. Now, these texts come from a Shaiva Tantric tradition. So the previous method I was talking about, we can trace its development from Tantric Buddhism. This one, we can trace we can trace its development from schools of Tantric Shaivism, okay? Various different lineages of Kaula Shaivism, Paschimamnaya, Dakshinamnaya, and Shambhava. Don't worry too much about that. But within those traditions as well, so nothing to do with Tantric Buddhism here, it's within those traditions that the idea of the chakras and Kundalini developed. And what's interesting here, I think, we were talking about this earlier in Finn's class, is how in the earlier texts, the first texts which teach about the chakras are very much something that you visualize, that you create with your mind, and they are each associated with a particular element. They start gross at the bottom, and they get more and more refined as you go up. And by meditating on each one, and you kind of reversing the process of creation, and then everything goes back to the bindu, the one point from which everything emanates when you reach the head. And that kind of visualization-based yoga, which developed in these Tantric Shaiva traditions, is then combined with or overlaid upon the physical yoga practice taught within these Amrita Siddhi traditions that I was mentioning. So we get this kind of confluence of different traditions, which sometimes leads to some sort of incongruities. We're never quite sure and obviously the manifestations today in which the chakras are often thought in some New Age traditions to be things that are actually existing within the body. It never really says that within the Haṭhayoga text, but we do see a development whereby certain techniques are said to work directly on particular chakras. I just included this image, which is from an unidentified chakra scroll in Nepal, just to show, I think this makes it quite clear, that there were more than one system of chakras. Now there's this idea of 6+1, with the Sahasrara at the top of the head is universally accepted, but in fact, there are all kinds of different systems taught within Sanskrit texts in India. So this one illustrates that. It also illustrates the fact that there are chakras beyond the body, above the head, shows that they can't actually exist within the body. They're not physical, material things. So it's this kind of combination of these visualization schools of yogic practice with a more physical, based in real physical substances. This creates this kind of clash to some extent. Okay, yes. So, if we go back to the Amrita Siddhi tradition, that's a kind of, it's seen as the Amrita Siddhi and Amarauga Prabodha, so the first group of texts I was looking at just now, they develop, it's a kind of eccentric, unusual, celibate ascetic tradition within Tantric Buddhism. So the Amrita Siddhi text, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, rejects the sexual ritual practices, and you can do everything within your own body. You don't need a ritual partner. Now, similarly, the schools of Tantric Shaivism, from which the last 3 texts I was talking about, with this different group of practices, the chakras and Kundalini, the ones from which they developed, they also practiced ritual sexual techniques. But the Nath tradition, which adopted them, then abandoned those, rejects those ritual sexual techniques. And it's said quite clearly at the end of one of these verses. You'll see here, at the end of one of the texts, this is the final verse of the Gorakshashataka. We drink the dripping liquid called bindu, not wine. So wine, drinking wine is associated with Kaula Tantric practice. We consume the rejection of the objects of the five senses, not meat. We do not embrace a sweetheart, we do not engage in sexual ritual, but the Sushumna Nadi, which is the central channel. And if we're going to have intercourse, it takes place in a mind dissolved in the void, not in a vagina. Okay, so we can see here very explicitly a rejection of tantric sexual ritual. And that's also shown in a legend that's very popular amongst these Nath yogi traditions, which goes back. I showed you those pictures, the statues of Matsyendra, and the legend is that Matsyendra went to the land of women, Khecarīvidyā, and he got sort of trapped there. So he ends up. Basically, the queen of Khecarīvidyā falls in love with him, and so he whiles away his time there, wine, women, and song. In fact, he has a son and everything. And then Goraknath, his disciple, who's the author, so Goraknath is the Hindi version of Goraksha, he hears about this, and he goes to rescue Matsyendra from the Khecarīvidyā, where he's in the palace with the queen. And that is seen as a sort of an allegory of Goraksha reforming the Nath tradition, so getting rid of tantric sexual ritual, straightening it up, and then from then on it becomes a celibate ascetic tradition. How are we doing? Is that a drum roll that it's time for me to finish, or how are we doing for time? This has gone down. I've got about 5 minutes more. I think I'm nearly there. Yes, so this is another point as well. The different traditions, when they come together, it creates sometimes confusion, well, particularly when in the Haṭhayoga, with this text which just tries to bring in absolutely everything. And so with Khecarī Mudra, the tongue practice, the Haṭhayoga includes two teachings on it. One of them, it's meant to, as I mentioned, so the second one, keep bindu in the head, it seals this liquid and stops it from dripping down. But in the other one, it raises Kundalini and then makes her flood the body with Amrita. So we get these different paradigms of yogic practice sometimes clashing. And then so the third and final tantric tradition I'm going to look at that was that contributed important practices to the Hatha Yoga tradition is these Vaishnava Tantra. So the Vimanarchana Kalpa is actually a pretty obscure text from the Vaikhanasa tradition, which is a very ancient ascetic tradition mentioned in the Mahabharata. In fact, I think the notion of Vaikhanasas goes way back to Vedic traditions. And it's in a text of this Vimanarchana Kalpa that we get the first, as I mentioned earlier, the first description of a non-seated yogic practice, one of these balancing postures, the Mayorasana. And then similarly, the Vasishta Samhita actually takes this verse, and well, this is in prose, but then Vasishta Samhita reworks it, includes that, and then adds others, including this Kukutasana. But the Vasishta Samhita, these are both kind of, compared to the other traditions I was looking at, these are pretty orthodox Brahmanical traditions. And in fact, this is for people in the world. I mean, it's very much orthodox. You're meant to follow the Brahmanical traditions, but you can be married. You can have a wife. It says that you can observe, that celibacy is, you're still observing celibacy if you only have sex with your wife at the prescribed time in the month and so forth. So we're seeing actually what I want to, I'm finishing up here, but what we do is we see with the early phase of the Hatha Yoga and physical yoga traditions as they're taught in text, we see the introduction of celibate ascetic practice, but then we see a kind of opening up and a universalization, and the kind of restrictions in the subsequent later texts in the Hatha Pradipika and so forth. It's not geared exclusively towards ascetics. Yes, and one other point I would say about that. So the Vimanarchana Kalpa is part of this Vaikhanasa ascetic Vaishnava Tantric tradition. Vasishta Samhita, a sort of related but distinct Pancharatra Vaishnava Tantric tradition. But they're both kind of orthodox, and in fact they include their yoga practice and these asanas, these complex asanas they're that they teach within an 8 anga, so the same as the 8 angas of Patanjali's yoga. Okay, so I think that's it for the three most important strains of kind of tantric originating yoga practice that come together to make Hatha Yoga. And then finally, I want to talk about, just briefly about Raja Yoga, maybe a couple of minutes more. But so I said that all these texts appear from about the 11th century onwards, and the reason why I believe they appear then is to do with the rise of monasteries within the Indian subcontinent. Monasteries associated with these celibate ascetic traditions, particularly in the Deccan, so central India and southern India as well. And we can pinpoint quite a few of the texts to particular regions and areas and specific monasteries in some cases where they appeared. Now, these traditions would have had their lineages of celibate ascetic yogis, but they also had their heads, the leaders of the mattas, which matta means monastery. And often, in several cases, the leader of the monastery was known as the Raja or the Raja Yogi. Okay, and he would not necessarily live quite such a disciplined ascetic life. And so the text, so Raja Yoga is kind of, there are different weightings within the different texts of how much ascetic practice you need to do and how you get to the state of Raja Yoga and being a Raja Yogi. Often it says only the very best, only the most talented, the person with the most strongest, best looking, most wonderful person can be the Raja Yogi, and everyone else has to do Hatha Yoga or Mantra Yoga or Laya Yoga. But so what it seems to me what's going on here is that the texts that teach Hatha Yoga are teaching the practices of these ascetics, but they're also making allowance for these Raja Yogis, who are the heads of the monasteries, who are allowed to do what they want. And we do have this one rather nice passage from 1510 from an Italian traveller to South India. And he's actually talking about the head of the monastery at that place, Kadri, that I showed you where the transition from Tantric Buddhism to Tantric Shaivism was. So I'll just read a bit of it out. So the king of the yogis, he's the head of the monastery. This king of the yogis is a man of great dignity and has about 30,000 people and is a pagan, he and all his subjects. He's considered to be saints. Custom of this king to go on a pilgrimage once in every 3 or 4 years, like a pilgrim, that is at the expense of others, with 3,000 or 4,000 of his people and with his wife and children. So we see that he's married, he's got children. And he takes 4 or 5 coursers and civet cats, apes, parrots, leopards, and falcons, and in this way he goes through the whole of India. So it's a rather amazing picture. And it then describes his entourage as well. So within these thousands of people that are going with him are these groups of these sort of ash-smeared, as we would understand, more traditional kind of celibate ascetic yogis as well. So yeah, my contention is that this is what's going on in the text. We're both, because of the rise of the monasteries, they're wanting to encode all their practices, so they're encoding Hatha Yoga, but they're also having to make room and make excuses for their Raja Yogis who are allowed to get up to whatever they like. And this is the final slide here from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, so very near the end of the text, when it's summarizing what happens with Raja Yoga. After obtaining the excellent Raja Yoga, which subjects all beings to his will, the yogi can do anything or nothing, behaving as he likes. Okay, so he's allowed to have as much fun as he wants. When the activity of the yogi is perfect without yoga, so he can then stop, he doesn't have to practice anymore, he's got there, he's done it all. Perfection stage arises, which bestows the rewards of enjoyment and liberation. Now, bhukti and mukti, so that's enjoyment and liberation. These are the aims of Tantra, basically. Tantric texts, you often get this division between the practitioner who's aiming at bhukti and the practitioner who's aiming at liberation, mukti. And here it's saying that the Raja Yogi can get all of it. And just the final thing I'll say is that it's because of this, I think it's because of this kind of chink in the ascetic, in the way that these ascetic practices are taught, that these allowances made for the Raja Yogi, that the text then can be applied to anyone. So we then get subsequent texts later on that employ this idea of the Raja Yoga, Raja Yogi and Raja Yoga, saying that the householder, the person living a normal life, can can also gain bhukti and mukti from following these practices within a regular life, and that has then led the way to the yoga that we have today. Okay, thank you. So I've no idea what the time is.
Do you think the rise of monasteries that you're talking about is related to the existence of Buddhist monasteries?
Well, the period I'm talking about really sees the demise of Buddhism in India. So, and this is what I'm arguing in this paper that's published today, that it's actually through this Haṭhayogic tradition, the first one of the three that I talked about, where we see we see the Tantric Buddhist tradition going into these Shaiva. You know, that's a way that Buddhism has survived in some way. And there, I think in that location that we're talking about, the monastery would have gone from being Buddhist to being Shaiva, the specific place. We see that the Shaivas take the place over from the Buddhists. Whether it's because of Buddhist monasteries, I think you know, we prior to this, it's from the 8th or 9th century that we see the rise of monasteries in India, Buddhist and otherwise. I'm not sure if we can associate that specifically with Buddhism.
So let's start on this side.
Hi, James. I really enjoyed your talk, and more. I mean, I'm like really. I've read your works, and I've read your guru's work, so as to say. So my question to you is something very specific, in the sense that in your scholarship, the Hatha Yoga is being. I'm not saying like it's getting isolated from the larger theological practices of all these various traditions. And I'm like, my question is that how a corporeal practice, let's say just any of the balancing act, for instance, has a, and this is kind of a Heideggerian moment, like has an ontological relationship to the theology. So for instance, what is the difference between, let's say, Khecarīvidyā, for instance, in a Vaishnava tradition and in a Shaiva tradition? Because my understanding is that they would definitely have a very different, I mean, I'm trying to use, I mean, the only term I keep on thinking is the ontological.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so wondering, so the question is that how these so many Hatha Yoga practices that are emerging in divergent practices and then coming together, converging, and then again diverging, what is the theological relationship to a bodily practice, to the theology of that particular ascetic at that particular monastic?
Okay. Well, yeah, it's a good question. In fact, there's a point I wanted to make is that, so I identified these three different tantric traditions, and even though all these things come together, for example, in the Hatha Pradipika, still those distinct lineages exist today, and they will have their sort of predilection for the different types of practice. So, you know, the last one I showed you, these Vaishnava traditions in which the asanas appeared. So to this day, the Vaishnava lineages, such as the Rāmānandīs, for example, they will have more of a predilection for doing these postures, whereas the Yogis are not really into doing the postures. They're more into these esoteric practices. You know, the mudras for controlling the vital energies. But some of the practices, I mean, lots of them are shared across the traditions. And just you mentioned Khecarīvidyā, they're practiced in the same way, as far as I understand. I mean, I know because I've asked people from all kinds of different traditions. The mechanics are the same, but then the broader framework. So, and it's the same as it was 1,000 years ago. So within the Shaiva traditions, for example, you know, you're kind of guaranteed. You know, by getting initiated, you're guaranteed enlightenment, and you're going to get the results from doing this practice. Whereas within the Ramanandi tradition, which is a Vaishnava devotional tradition, even if you master all these yogic practices, it doesn't mean you're going to get enlightened unless you get the prasada, the grace of God. So yeah, I think that, as I say, there are predilections for different things within different traditions. But then even when the same practices are being done, yeah, they are framed in a different overall theological framework.
So the efficacies of these practices would be different in different theological laws?
Yes, yeah. I think that the devotional traditions are ultimately down to God. I mean, I don't know if we can I mean, that's the big distinction, really, between the more bhakti-oriented traditions and the more, or the less bhakti-oriented traditions.
Hi, James. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question regarding, I guess, meditation and the mind and all of that. And I believe I don't know if it's Patanjali's definition of yoga being the chitta vritti nirodha. And where does that fall? Because partly I've heard, or I grew up in India, I've heard all kinds of stories, and I've seen people. And people used to say that when you're meditating, mudras and these postures actually just spontaneously happen. So I don't know what came first, whether these postures were defined or the mind and the nature of the mind was defined first. So I'm just trying to kind of understand your perspective on that. And the fact that looks like women were probably not liberated at that time, so there's not much that's spoken. It's very interesting that you didn't find much about women, so to speak, and enlightenment.
Okay, well, so starting with the first thing about chitta vritti nirodha, within some of the textual traditions, certainly that is kind of that is accommodated within the practice, and particularly Raja Yoga. Certain texts will identify. In fact, the Amarāga Prabodha, I think that slide I put up, if I remember rightly. Where is it? Gosh, oh right, it goes all the way back. Sorry, here. So Raja Yoga, Chitta Vritti Rahitaha. So it's basically it's devoid of any fluctuations of the mind. So the Raja Yoga as the goal is or as the highest practice is generally identified with samadhi, and samadhi is understood to be absence of mental activity. In terms of the mudra, I've heard that with the mudras, but Khecarī mudra, for example, I've met a few yogis who've said that it just happens spontaneously, that the tongue just flicks up into place. But I think that other ones are a bit, things like standing on your head, that's not going to happen spontaneously, is it? I don't think so. Yeah, I think we can maybe draw a distinction between those two. But with the breath as well, of course, mental states make your breath stop, and vice versa. So there's understood to be an idea that if you stop your breath, you still your mind, because if you still your mind, your breath stops. So, but I think we can distinguish between the practices that are like that and practices which aren't. And your third question was about women. Yeah. Well, I think I think that's related to the fact that the texts were all composed in monasteries. As I was saying, this is a kind of working hypothesis. I've got a draft paper on this at the moment. But the monasteries were all for celibate males, so the texts are written in Sanskrit, which was a preserve of men, and they're written for male practitioners. But there are one or two, we were talking about this earlier actually in Finn's class, there are one or two references to women who are well versed in yoga practice. So that Vajroli Mudra technique that I mentioned, a couple of texts which say women can do that, or there are still remnants of the Tantric Buddhist sexual ritual in a couple of these texts in the context of Vajroli Mudra, and it says, it's talking to the man again, but says you need to find a woman who is expert at yoga. So thereby we know that there were women who are expert at yoga. And another thing I'm at a conference next month. I'm giving a paper on women in Haṭhayoga, and I've just found out I've got to speak for 40 minutes, and I'm not quite sure I'm going to fill 40 minutes. But I'm quite excited to have found this Marathi text called the Lila Charitra, which includes legends of 30 or 40 saints and siddhas, amongst whom are 5 or 6 women, and they're yoga practitioners. One of them is actually called a Haṭhayogini. Her name is Kamakya or Kamakhi. But she, interestingly, she's a Hatha Yogini, but she's associated with sexual ritual. She's trying to get men to do her rites with in the legend. So yeah, we can be. I'm sure the numbers were smaller, I expect, but we know that women were doing these practices. We just have next to no information on them.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that talk. I guess one of the most exciting implications or even conclusions of this talk is kind of finding the earliest codification of Hatha Yoga in not just in a Tantric milieu, but in a Tantric Buddhist milieu, correct, right? So I'm very curious about just how this, how you're thinking of this research as you continue to kind of excavate these kind of genealogies of Hatha Yoga, and if there are, assuming that Amrita-Siddhi is not just a one-off, where do you look for antecedents of a text like that if we want to, if you want to continue to, plumb the depths of these, these early codifications?
Okay, well, my inclination, it probably is a one-off, the Amrita-Siddhi, although because it's very much kind of eccentric compared to the rest of the Tantric Buddhist tradition, to the extent that, it's not even that obviously Tantric Buddhist, but there are certain key terms in it which I didn't understand. It's only because I'm editing it with Peter Santo, who's an expert in Tantric Buddhism, that he was able to identify certain terms which meant nothing to me. And then slowly it dawned on us, my God, actually this is, everyone previously, it's not been published or translated, it's only available in manuscripts, but people knew of it, and there was an article by Curtis Schaefer 15 years ago. Everyone assumed it was Shaiva, but I think we've now proved it was Buddhist. But there's an Amrita-Siddhi Mula, so it's a very short text which consists of, that means the root text of the Amrita-Siddhi, which consists of the 3 or 4 chapters about the practice itself. And that, it looks like that's older, but that only exists in Tibetan. So the text continued in India, but wasn't super popular, but in Tibet it developed its own much bigger kind of more complicated cycle, and it becomes, through a back translation, and somehow, anyway, Amara-Siddhi when it comes back into Sanskrit, but there are lots of different manuscripts of it in Tibetan. So that's obviously the next area to explore it in, but I don't think we'll get earlier. I think we'll just see how it developed within Tibet. And I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow, but I don't know Tibetan. Not going to be, unless it's not going to be me in the near future anyway.
So I'm curious about where you were going at the end with Raja Yoga, and if I understood you correctly, you were giving a kind of cynical reading of the open-endedness, the forgiveness for the Raja Yogan being able to do whatever they want. And then here you have this, the last line of this verse 3 that you have up there. They're the one who are chitta-vritti drahita. And it's kind of in my Gita class, we're discussing a lot about what I call these kind of forgiveness clauses. So in the 4th chapter, I forget what the terminology is, but the person, maybe like Papakrittamaha, who is on the boat of knowledge and they cross over. In the 9th chapter, you have the Sudurachara, who is Sadhureva Samantavya. He's considered a saintly person. And even in the end, in the Gita, you have this notion of don't worry about dharma, just come to me, I'll free you from all sin. I'm wondering how you see this kind of open, and also this notion of the Jivan Mukta, but I'm wondering how you see the kind of open-endedness of the Raja Yoga practice as, you kind of present it as you can do whatever you want. It's how you see that in relationship to these kinds of statements that you find in this kind of bhakti literature in places like the Gita that kind of have this room out, and there's multiple interpretations, but there's room for all sorts of possible imperfections as one is engaged in the practice of other kinds of yoga, and how you see how that relates to the kinds of open-endedness of Raja Yoga here.
Well, I think with the notion of Raja Yoga is that it's not necessarily excusing imperfections in the practice, because the Raja Yogi is there. He's got to the final aim. So I don't think it's in the same way. It's then excusing his behavior once he's got there. And in fact, there's one.
Like the 4th chapter of the Gita, perhaps, that you're on the boat of knowledge.
Once you've arrived, yeah, okay, yes, yeah, sorry. I'm a bit rusty on my Gita, so I've been stuck in the Haṭhayoga text too much. But in fact, the only. So often in these texts, Vajroli Mudra is associated with Raja Yoga. So this is the practice that's meant to, it says you can have sex with as many women as you want because you don't lose your bindu, it doesn't matter, and you're still okay. And in fact, the only reference I've ever found to that outside of a Hatha Yoga text is in the Khecarīvidyā, and it's a passing the earliest one, it's in a passing reference to Krishna, and it's saying that it was through Krishna's mastery of Vajroli that he was able to have 16,000 girlfriends. Okay, which I thought might be of interest to you anyway. But yeah, the Raja Yogi, he's there, you know, and I just think, I mean, I can't sort of prove it, but it seems that the fact that we have this notion of these Raja Yogis, who are the heads of the monasteries, and this idea of Raja Yoga appears at the same time, I don't think the two can be dissociated. So yeah, perhaps I was being a little cynical, and maybe there's reason to be cynical as well, that they are perhaps abusing their position in some circumstances, who knows, by saying, look, I'm the Raja Yogi, I've arrived, I can do what the hell I want, you know.
Do you think these texts are totally sincere in their willingness, or do you think that they're, in other words, are you sort of, is this your own cynicism, or do you think that there might have been quiet, between the lines discontent?
No, I don't see any cynicism in the texts themselves, no, because I think they're almost produced to justify the position of the Raja Yogi. Yeah, so I don't, yeah. And we see, I mean, it's still, the notion of the Raja Yogi exists today, so Modi is sometimes called a Raja Yogi, and particularly Yogi Adityanath in UP, the chief minister, there's a book about him called Raja Yogi, you know, this idea of the yogi who's also a king, although in his case, I guess he's not, well, no, maybe he is, yeah, he needs some excusing as well, perhaps, in some cases.